I would argue that, and please understand, this is not really meant as a partisan or political point, because I think that the Reagan Revolution did many very good things and was very dynamic. It infused a kind of private sector dynamism into the country that was needed. But I would say that the fundamental trend line that was put in place from the 1980s on has been a massive disinvestment in the public sources of our strength, and a massive a series of incentives for the private sector, for the private sources. To put it in very blunt terms, we underfunded infrastructure, education, communities, and we overdid it with tax cuts. And what you see as a result is the America we know, which is private affluence and public squalor. What we see is an America in which you have given a series of massive tax breaks to people at the higher end of the income scale, who have used them to build larger houses than they need, with larger and fancier kitchens than they need. But meanwhile, our schools are in disrepair. Our roads are in disrepair. Our airports are the United States has barely 100 kilometers of high-speed rail. In the same period of time, China has built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world has put together.
Since I promised I didn't want to talk about Turkey, let's talk about Turkey for a minute. Because you raised it, and we were talking about it backstage, and I really appreciated your take. I'd asked Fareed backstage, what's your take on the recent election in Turkey? Can we take it at face value? And your perspective on that, I thought, was just very spot on and interesting.
So I think one thing we need to understand about democracy, and it's as true here as it is in any other country in the world, there are two components to democracy, to a liberal democracy. There's the democratic component, which is holding the elections, secret ballots, make sure that they're held in a fair way. But there's also the liberal side to it, which, by the way, doesn't mean liberal as in liberal and conservative. It means liberal as in the original Latin word of liberty, protecting liberty. And what does that liberal part mean? It means you want independent courts. You want a free media. In most countries, it means the separation of church and state. It means independent agencies of bureaucracy that cannot be politicized. Protection of individual rights, minority rights, religious freedoms. That combination of things is what we call liberal democracy. And in some ways, the liberal part is actually fighting with the democratic part. So what is the American Bill of Rights, if not a series of statements of what democratically elected majorities cannot do? It's saying you may have won the biggest landslide in the world, but you cannot abridge freedom of speech. You cannot abridge freedom of association. You cannot ask people to testify against their will. There's a whole series of protections that are limitations on the power of democratic governments. That combination is what creates the magic of liberal democracy. If we aren't able to figure this stuff out, I regard a lot of the other problems, some of the dysfunctions that have happened in the Republican Party, these are all follow-on phenomena. You've got to get at the heart of the problem. And the heart of the problem is that you've created a system where you really don't have, majority rule anymore. You have basically minority rule. I mean, how is it that on things like gun control, majority of Americans are in favor of something, but it can't get through? On abortion, there's a sensible common ground where the majority of Americans agree on, but you can't get enacted. That, to me, is a sign your democracy is not working.